circa 2007, regarding 1981 and 1965. One evening in the mid-aughts, my roommate stuck his head into my bedroom in our college apartment and said, "Hey Josh, you're white. Who sang Tainted Love?" I answered easily and without thought. Soft Cell. At the time, I didn't know why I knew this, nor could I have said clearly why my Mexican roommate assumed that this was information all white people would instantly have to hand. But he did, and I did. When I've told this story since, most people find it pleasantly resonant, in a honky's gonna honk kind of way. But a few have offered me a truth that I, in my whiteness, did not know then, but do know now. Soft Cell's Tainted Love is a cover. The original, recorded by Gloria Jones in 1964, was released as the B-side to a single that nobody remembers. It got traction in the UK club scene in the 70s, so Jones re-recorded it, but the re-release also flopped. It was not until Soft Cell released it in 1981 that it became a huge commercial success, and also, perhaps relatedly, a thing of whiteness. I began this essay by looking at the one-hit wonders of the 1980s and asking what seemed a simple question. Why did so many of the songs here also bring other bands to the top 40? Why, for example, does Axel F. bring Harold Faltermeyer, an otherwise unremarkable film composer, to number 3 worldwide, sit dormant for 2 decades, and then somehow manage to bring this monstrosity to number 50 on the Billboard Hot 100? I set out to make sense of why some songs manage to bring more than one band to the national stage. Each of these connections is a cover that charted, and in a lot of these cases, the bands at either end never did anything else anyone remembers. This was, at the outset, an academic question about the charts. What I found was unexpected, but certainly not surprising. I found what anyone does when they attempt to Scooby-Doo the inner workings of anything touched by capitalism. Turns out, it was white supremacy all along. 1997, and also 1982. The first one-hit wonder that felt like it belonged to me was also, unsurprisingly, very white. My high school years overlapped with the hallucinatory moment in the 90s where we all said, "Hey, remember Swing?" And then we all took dance classes and started wearing wallet chains and almost instantly became mortified by what we'd just done in a moment of what might be called post-Zoot clarity. Third wave ska was a part of our recovery process, and from that maelstrom of shame and hope and overenthusiastic horn sections arose, for a brief moment, Save Ferris. I still love It Means Everything, Save Ferris's first full-length album, but almost nobody heard anything other than the album's one big hit. Save Ferris as a band was a meaningful representation of a moment, a near reification of the great mood of a generation who saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off as aspirational, and chessboards as fashion forward, and the trombone as a reasonable thing for a teenager to want to own. They had the technical chops and the right energy and the backing of a big label whose execs undoubtedly mentioned their name in the same sentence as the word zeitgeist at least a dozen times a week. And yet, Save Ferris, despite all of that, is a one-hit wonder. Unless you're strangely obsessed with the 1998 Mark Wahlberg vehicle The Big Hit, the only song you've ever heard of theirs is Come On Eileen. Which is, you might observe, already a one-hit wonder. Every one-hit wonder is an artist that, just for a moment, comes into contact with something that resonates the whole world, setting us all ahum with sympathetic vibrations so that we are, however briefly, on the same frequency. So when a band becomes a one-hit wonder, what is it that they reach out and touch? Save Ferris touched it in 1997 with Come On Eileen, at which point No Doubt's Tragic Kingdom was well on its way to becoming a diamond record. The bands are not dissimilar. Brash and punchy ska with an energetic band backing a charismatic frontwoman. Both bands sounded the sonorous tone that reverberates through all of us, but while No Doubt walked the path to that mysterious chime half a dozen times, Save Ferris never found it again. Only Come On Eileen brought them to that resonance, even as it had brought Dexy's Midnight Runners there 15 years before. A band who makes hits is easy to understand. A hit that makes bands, I think, is something else entirely. 1980 and again 1986. One of the most durable one-hit wonders of the 1980s is Funky Town. If you paid attention to the charts in the 1980s, though, you might reasonably have cause to ask, which Funky Town? Because as it happens, Funky Town has the distinction of having made not one but two bands a one-hit wonder in the same decade. Lip Sync, the originator of Funky Town, created the disco smash in 1980, but it was only 6 years before Pseudo Echo took the track back into the top 40 as rock. As genres, disco and rock are both stories of white subsumption, but it's fascinating to see it happen so quickly. Briefly rising as disco fell, Lips Inc. was a biracial dyad and a diverse suite of session musicians who sent Funky Town out of Minneapolis and into the world. Then, in 1986, Pseudo Echo took it up again, with the disco and the diversity washed away. The new Funky Town was not, in my estimation, meaningfully funky. What it was instead was white. Indeed, it is very difficult to imagine anything whiter than a keytar played by an Australian with acid-washed jeans rolled up above his high-top chucks. This Funky Town is so white that one could draw the entire performance without needing a second crayon. There is something crucial here, I think. To become a hit again, Funky Town had to become, in some way, whiter. I do not mean the artists. In fact, when a song makes more than one band a one-hit wonder, it seems to suggest that the artist is in a way immaterial. After all, Dexy's Midnight Runners and Save Ferris feel approximately equal in their whiteness to me. What changed between the two successes of Funky Town and between the two successes of Come On Eileen was the song's ability to reach out to the whiteness of the moment. When 74% of the national population is white, whiteness will always have an outsized influence on success by simple force of majority. And what that whiteness demands at the moment is, by extension, what sells. Plenty of bands make it and plenty of bands don't. But when a band that doesn't reaches out and touches that ineffable something that makes them a one-hit wonder, I think perhaps what they are touching is, for want of a better term, the whitegeist. (1981, 1968, 1955, 1954, 1954, and 1954). Funky Town and Come On Eileen are not the only songs on the list to reach out to whiteness, nor is this a phenomenon unique to one-hit wonders. Emmylou Harris's Mr. Sandman is a song whose recording history is surprisingly white, back through Burt Kaempfert, Chet Atkins, the Four Aces, the Chordettes, to Vaughn Monroe and his orchestra, white musicians all, and stretching back further to the so-called race music of pre-war America. The vibrant melange of black music that would spawn the blues, doo-wop, Motown, soul, funk, R&B, and much of the broad panoply of American musical culture also spawned white imitators, who made black music more palatable for the whiter white audiences who held the buying power. To be clear here, I am talking about racism. This practice of whitewashing was, for decades, simply the nature of the industry. We know Tutti Frutti now as the work of Little Richard, which it always was. When it was young, however, it was more strongly associated with Pat Boone, whose non-threatening whiteness repackaged black musical labor as safe for the likes of the Cleavers and the Petries. Of Boone's milquetoast persona, critic Lisa Tomlinson wrote that the record company circulated those types of images in the form of whiteness to appease white people, and they have that power because of the institutional system.
It was, at that time, an absolute wall between pop and R&B. It was not going to get played in its original form on pop stations. It was just too ragged and too, in some cases it was a little suggestive or more, sometimes even explicit.
Now, the Pat Boone, he was a white guy that then took my music and made my hit, and this was my chance to be a big star, and he shortcutting me and gonna outsell me, which he did with my song that I wrote.
And perhaps it is not surprising that in his attempt to recover God from whiteness, James Baldwin paused to capture the blandness of white musical sensibilities. White Americans seem to feel that happy songs are happy and sad songs are sad, he wrote in 1962, and that, God help us, is exactly the way most white Americans sing them, sounding in both cases so helplessly, defenselessly fatuous that one dare not speculate on the temperature of the deep freeze from which issue their brave and sexless little voices. Little Richard, black and flamboyant and irresistibly alive, is full of complications and contradictions and heat that read as danger to white audiences. Thus, Pat Boone. By the 80s, there was not quite the same formal, intentional system of whitewashing as placed Boone above Little Richard on the charts, but the market forces that drove that system were still strongly at play. Whiter audiences were and are whiter audiences. And so it is that any artist in any decade who goes in search of that deep resonance is, in effect, attempting to capture the attention of those so alienated from themselves as to prefer Pat Boone to Little Richard. Do not mistake me. That Boone himself as white is to some extent immaterial, or rather it is a function of the demands of the Whitegeist of 1955. The broad white audiences of 1955 demanded a cover of a black artist by a white performer. And in a way you can track what white audiences demand by following Mr. Sandman through its various iterations up to Emmylou Harris in 1981. But what of those cases where white audiences would rather see certain kinds of performances from certain kinds of performers of color? In other moments, and perhaps more dangerously, one-hit wonders tell a story of how easily the Whitegeist can exert a horrible force on blackness. In fact, let us leave the 1980s for a moment to seek clarity. 1974, but very definitely not 1975. In 1974, one artist sounded the reverberant chime of top 40 greatness and then spent a year trying exactingly to replicate the magic that had brought him there. The artist was black, and the song's topic was the sort of exploitative Pan-Asian caricature that can only be described as Oriental. But the songs that resulted were somehow, unequivocally and without qualification, white. I refer, of course, to Carl Douglas and his 1974 smash, Kung Fu Fighting. Everybody was Kung Fu fighting. There's a scene from the US version of The Office where office prankster Jim discovers that the curmudgeonly Stanley is inexplicably delighted by pranks involving meatballs. Ever on the hunt for a game audience, Jim begins filling the seat, drawers, and office supplies of perpetual victim Dwight with meatballs. Subsequently, it is revealed that the whole operation was a ploy by Dwight and Stanley to get free meatballs. This maps surprisingly well. Jim is Carl Douglas, Dwight is the music industry, Stanley is the Whitegeist, and the meatballs are racism. When Douglas dropped the single for Kung Fu Fighting in 1974, it had exactly the blend of danceability and campy exploitation that the listening public wanted, spending 2 weeks at number 1 on the Hot 100. And so, understandably, Douglas attempted to recreate his success by shaping himself into the form he thought the market desired. In 1975, he released his second single, Dance the Kung Fu, which breached the Hot 100, but which came nowhere near the top 40. For clarity, I should point out that no, this is not the same song you were just listening to. I'm not even sure it's the same outfit. I actually think he owned 2 different red satin karate gis. The Whitegeist is fickle. Is it too much to say that Douglas simply rediscovered what so many people of color have always known, that the acceptance of the white world is always contingent and never predictable? That the things that whiteness says it values are never reliably enough? That, as Ariel Felton writes, even if you use your blinker and follow every traffic law, a cop will pull you over and ask where a girl like you got a car like this. Even if you sound like a white girl over the phone, you might not get the job after the in-person interview. Even if you're a childless A+ college student with 2 jobs, your white boyfriend's parents will say he can do better. There is in effect no meaningful difference between Kung Fu Fighting and Dance the Kung Fu. Both tried to do everything the Whitegeist seemed to call for. One was accepted by the great white world, the other was not. Carl Douglas, like every one-hit wonder, managed to grab hold of audiences just for a moment, but could not figure out how to do so again. Because to do so is to capture the fickle whimsy of white people, the vast mass of our demographic majority who look at culture as people that never have to view difference except as a spectator. People who, for a time, thought that we should bring back swing. People who watched Blackula and Shaft and all the other blaxploitation films of the 70s. People who were about to turn one of the greatest musicians of all time into an absolute cartoon. (1988) Unjustly. The greatest victim of the Whitegeist that the 1980s have to offer is, without question, Bobby McFerrin. You're already humming it, aren't you? In 2004, Blender ranked Don't Worry Be Happy at number 7 on their list of the 50 worst songs ever. For the vast majority of people, it is all Bobby McFerrin will ever be, which is an absolute travesty because Bobby McFerrin is one of the most impressive vocal performers the world has ever seen. What McFerrin can do with his voice is simply unfathomable. In 1984, his album The Voice hit number 24 on the US jazz charts as the first solo vocal jazz album recorded without accompaniment or overdubbing. The album culminated in a solo vocal scat cover of Duke Ellington's Take the A-Train that is as playful as it is artful. He has released albums with Chick Corea and Yo-Yo Ma, and he is no less a virtuoso with his instrument than those artists are with theirs. This work, however, was not of interest to white audiences. Instead, the White Guys chose to embrace him at his goofiest, with a fake, not quite Jamaican accent and a simpering, sickly sweet motto which perhaps not coincidentally suggests that economic injustice can be overcome by a plucky attitude. Don't Worry Be Happy is so white that, and I am not making this up, George H.W. Bush briefly used it as his campaign song in 1988 until McFerrin vocally disapproved. McFerrin hasn't quite disavowed Don't Worry Be Happy, but he hasn't performed it since the year it was released. He talks about it almost as if it were completely separate from himself and his work.
That song became a hit all by itself. All by itself. I recorded this tune, it shoots out of the gate, starts selling millions of copies, and what do? I stay home.
In contrast with Carl Douglas, he did not want to chase the White Geist. Nevertheless, this is the Bobby McFerrin we remember. Not the NEA Jazz Master, not the man honored by the Acapella Awards for a lifetime of achievement, not the man who managed to earn by virtue of dedication and consummate devotion an honorary doctorate from the Berklee College of Music. We remember the Bobby McFerrin of Don't Worry Be Happy, because, among other things, when we're talking about one-hit wonders and the oppressive power of the White Geist, we're also talking about what kinds of blackness society deems acceptable. (1979, 2019, and what passed between them. McFerrin is an example of an individual artist who was, at least in terms of his cultural legacy, dramatically reduced by his encounter with the White Geist. But if you really want to understand the raw normative power of the white listening public, there is no better place to start than Rapper's Delight, released in 1979 and charting in 1980 for the Sugar Hill Gang, because it is an almost perfect synecdoche for what the White Geist will do to hip-hop in the 80s and 90s. Rapper's Delight is, even by the standards of 80s one-hit wonders, just really fucking weird. It's just 3 dudes in their early 20s in a recording studio for the very first time, passing the mic back and forth like they were at a party. They just kept playing around until they had 15 minutes of content that was all over the place. Does Superman have a micro penis? Anybody got friends whose moms can't cook? What if we paraphrase the book of Ecclesiastes? Did you know I have a checkbook? Supposedly the track was so long that Grandmaster Caz fell asleep listening to the raw cut. What results is a sort of semiotic morass, a pot full of a wild melange of ideas. In her phenomenal book, The Hip Hop Wars, from which I'm borrowing the core of the argument in this section, Trisha Rose argues that in the 80s, gangster rappers were only part of a much larger iconic tapestry. There were many varieties of equally positioned styles of rap, gangsta as well as party, political, Afrocentric, and avant-garde, each with multiple substyles as well. Hip-hop was a vibrant, diverse, and complex popular genre. The baffling variety of Rapper's Delight showcases this. It's a sort of primordial soup of all the things that hip-hop might someday come to mean. And it was the first hip-hop track to hit the Billboard Hot 100. First contact, if you will, between hip-hop and the White Geist. I use the primordial soup metaphor intentionally here. In Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, no, don't leave. He introduces the idea of the meme, not in the way that we use it now, but as a sort of semiotic equivalent to gene. To sum up his extremely Dawkinsian argument, ideas replicate and change and survive in the same way that genes do, which makes them equally subject to natural selection. Jokes that are funny get retold, and the funniest versions get retold the most, so each joke evolves toward its funniest version. And yet,
You've been meatballed.
natural selection, artificial selection. So, if Rapper's Delight is this vast mass of ideas that were possible in hip-hop, what happens when that is exposed to the normative selective power of mainstream white audiences? hip-hop grew up alongside SoundScan, which revealed that the people who were buying the most hip-hop were largely white and largely tweens. Sexual, socially underdeveloped, uncertain, and afraid of the other gender, honing their newfound skills in profanity, and ready to act out their anxieties about females through aggression and derision. This is the cohort for which the major labels would package their hip-hop products. Hip-hop also grew up around the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Please Don't Leave, which effectively eliminated constraints on how many radio stations a corporation could own, meaning that more and more of the decisions about what hip-hop would be were handled not by DJs at locally owned radio stations in black communities, but by corporate execs in Manhattan boardrooms. And those decisions were being made not for the needs or benefit of the black and indigenous people of color who hip-hop purported to represent, but in response to what those execs thought their young white audience might want to see out of hip-hop. As Yasin Bey, then performing as Mos Def, put it,
"Old white men is running this rap shit. Corporate force is running this rap shit. Some tall Israeli is running this rap shit. We poke out our asses for a chance to cash in. Cocaine is running this rap shit."
The artificial selection of the white geist has done its work on hip-hop. You can draw a line between Master G flirting with everyone in the club and bitches ain't shit. You can draw a line between Hank shit-talking Superman and Eminem strangling a guy for looking at him funny. You can draw a line between Big Bank Hank's checkbook and credit cards and Ye and Jay deconstructing a Maybach in the video for Otis. What are they destroying with their hammers and their saws? Questlove asked in an essay in Vulture in 2014. And what are they building as they destroy? The idea that they exist at a level where they can afford to discard something as valuable as the car? The idea that their cool transcends money and the things it can acquire? Rose refers to gangsters, pimps, and hoes as the holy trinity of hip-hop, the signifiers that came to dominate rap in the 90s and 2000s. And you can see it in Rapper's Delight. But where in the post-white geist hip-hop is Ecclesiastes? Where is Wonder Mike's friend's mom and her terrible cooking? Where, in fact, is the Rapper's Delight? It's not gone, of course, and I don't mean to oversimplify hip-hop. Political hip-hop, protest hip-hop, queer hip-hop, progressive hip-hop, these things have always been there, even if they lost space on the grand stage of corporate hip-hop. But we also can't deny that, as Rose says, what I'm calling the white geist has played a central role in the near depletion of hip-hop, wringing it dry by pandering to America's racist and sexist lowest common denominator. As Chuck D noted in his essay Death of a Nation, it's hard for me to support an 85% white teenage audience scream and smoke that and call it the shit. And as Rose notes, we have arrived at a landmark moment in modern culture when a solid segment, if not a majority, of an entire generation of African American youth understands itself as defined primarily by a musical, cultural form. Which is to say, the cultural movement, which has come in some ways to define blackness, overlaps substantially with a corporate product manufactured to the specifications of the white geist. And so last February, when Dre, Snoop, Eminem, Kendrick, and Mary J. Blige performed at the Super Bowl halftime show, my dad made a comment along the lines of, "I just don't know why people would make music so violent, so vulgar, so lewd." And I had to explain to him, because of me, Dad. Because in the late 90s, I was a white teenager who listened to a lot of hip-hop. And so I was one of the millions who stirred the primordial soup of hip-hop and helped turn this into this. Hotel, motel, Holiday Inn. Thankfully, not 2019. Allow me to subvert myself. My two major sources for the last section, Trisha Rose's The Hip Hop Wars and MK Asante's It's Bigger Than Hip Hop, were both published in 2008. More than a decade later, a track arose that was arguably explicitly tailored for the white geist in a way few tracks ever were, but it came not out of the boardrooms of Asante and Bey's Old White Men, but from the TikTok account of a barb with $30 for a beat and a folder full of memes. In 2019, the Great Resonance chimed like a motherfucker for Lil Nas X and Old Town Road.
I got the horses in the bag, horse stock is attached.
If the white geist model of musical transcendence were complete, or if the story I just told about hip-hop was over, I think that would have been the end. Everything about Old Town Road feels to me like a one-hit wonder. It has the same elements of caricature that drive kung fu fighting, and we know how well replicating that worked out for Carl Douglas. It has the dangerous vitality that would have led to a Pat Boone cover a few decades previously. It even has some of the silliness that kept us from seeing Bobby McFerrin as anything other than a cartoon. McFerrin, after all, didn't feel in control of Don't Worry, Be Happy.
That song became a hit all by itself.
If what I have said here was the whole of the truth, Lil Nas X would have evaporated like so many other TikTok fads before and since. Thankfully, he did not. Instead, he has continued to push against the norms, assumptions, and expectations that the industry has established about what white audiences want. He has made music that is, to call back, vibrant, diverse, and complex in ways that encompass and expand what might have seemed possible for the Sugar Hill Gang. And he's done it by playing with mainstream audiences in ways that weren't available to Wonder Mike and Big Bang Hank and Master D.
I saw you tweet that you love pissing people off.
That was a fucking troll tweet, honestly.
You troll a lot, don't you? You troll a lot.
That's my thing.
So what would you call what you do? Trolling, marketing, what is it?
It's all of it. Mm-hmm. It's all of it. It's trolling, it's marketing. It works.
Marketing Old Town Road with a master's thesis level array of memes, releasing shoes dyed in his own blood during Easter week, and being horny on Maine in ways that few artists dare to dream of.
What's different between this success you're having now and the success you had with Old Town Road?
This success, I feel like I'm much more in control of, you know? Like, I feel like I have the reins on it, and I'm making my calculated moves in the way I feel I need to make them. And I feel like anybody that's pissed off are the exact people that need to be pissed off, you know?
He's toyed with the Whitegeist. He has, in essence, lap danced with the devil in a way that's allowed him to find success with a kind of music that would not have been possible in the industry even 5 years before he started.
Did you ever think you was gonna be a one-hit wonder? Or did that ever cross your mind?
That never really crossed my mind.
(1853, 1968, 2009). More than once during his presidency, Barack Obama spoke words that sounded that deep reverberation within us all.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
And as in so many other cases, that struck chord resonated with another.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
These men both knew the chime well, knew our harmonics, knew how to make us hum and tremble and sing together. But it is perhaps no surprise to know that behind them was another. King, too, was paraphrasing the American abolitionist Theodore Parker, who in 1853 wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Parker is not well remembered now. He persists in this quotation, mostly. Call him a one-hit wonder. But all three of these men spoke to the hope of the slow but inexorable erosion of white supremacy, and all witnessed and helped effect huge diminutions of that sinister edifice. It feels laughable to include such weighty ideas in a video that also includes this preposterous flailing honky. Not me, Pat Boone. But at the same time, in context, amid all of this, it is undeniable that this preposterous flailing honky is an agent of white supremacy. He's still alive, by the way, appearing on the 700 Club and hosting galas in support of Israel. His last blog post from May 2020 declares that God not happy about COVID relief. As I worked on this script, one phrase kept running through my head over and over. The arc of the one-hit wonder is short and bends toward whiteness. I knew, of course, that I was altering a well-known quotation for reasons of quippiness, but when I let that phrase into the center of my attention, I realized the content of that quotation, and the story of which that quotation is a part. And seeing a connection between that story and the story I'm telling here, I wrote this paragraph. I'm not going to read it, but you can. I don't want you to hear it in my voice because it's not a part of the script for this essay. I removed it because I asked myself what all white men quoting Barack Obama or Martin Luther King Jr. should. Am I inserting myself in a story that is not mine to tell? In putting myself into Parker's shoes, in pretending to calculate the trajectory of history alongside King and Obama, I was interjecting my loud and vapid white thoughts into a conversation which did not need me. I was Macklemoring. I Macklemore still, perhaps. I know whiteness, and it was my whiteness that brought me into this conversation. My roommate knew Tainted Love, but he did not know Gloria Jones. For most of us, Bobby McFerrin is at best the guy who sang Don't Worry, Be Happy. We all know Mr. Sandman, even if we've never heard of Emmylou Harris or the Four Aces or the Chordettes, and even if we assumed, like I always did, that it was originally recorded by black artists. The arcs of all of these musicians are bent by the gravitic pull of the white geist. When 74% of the listening audience is white, it is perhaps predictable that it is they who decide what to pick up, marvel at briefly, and cast aside like socks on Christmas morning. The one-hit wonder is, I suspect, a phenomenon of white fascination. But that is not the story here. The story here is Little Richards, upstaged and outsold by this car lot tube man filled with mayonnaise. The story is the hundreds of black-run local radio stations bought out and gutted in the wake of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, tearing the hubs of organization and communication out of black communities nationwide. The story is that we remember Fuck the Police as a celebration of violence rather than what it is, a condemnation of racist police brutality. The story is that we remember Yasiin Bey not as an outspoken political commentator and reform demander, but as the explosives guy from The Italian Job. The story is black voices in music speaking out and against the systems that oppress them. Kendrick Lamar on police violence and All Right, J. Cole on white distrust and Neighbors, Tupac, Public Enemy, dozens of others reaching all the way back to 1939 and Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, the song called the beginning of the civil rights movement. But what one-hit wonders show us is that what gets spins, what gets airtime, what gets played to the ears and minds of the nation is the version most palatable to the white geist. How much do we lose when all we have is the caricature? How much do we take away? Thanks for watching. This video is a little different from what we usually do on the channel because it was made as an extracurricular essay for March Madness 2023. If you're here from the tournament, welcome. If you're thinking, I wish he'd had more to say about Crazy Frog, it's probably worth your time to subscribe. If you aren't aware of March Xmas, it's a series of yearly March Madness style tournaments of essays about songs. This year, each essayist is writing about a one-hit wonder from the 1980s. Throughout March, we'll read, listen, and vote on essays until only one remains standing. The tournament will be kicking off at the beginning of March, and I can't wait to see what the essayists have to say about some of the tracks I've mentioned. There are some good matchups in week 1, with Come On Eileen and Mr. Sandman facing off in the first round. And if you want to throw in for a long shot, poor old Harold Faltermeyer over here is stacked up against Kate Bush and running up that hill. It's going to be a hell of a tournament. Thanks also to the editors for their patience as I edited this absolute monstrosity of a video.
These